History books show us the pyramids, the golden masks, the towering temples. But there is another side of ancient Egypt that most people never see. A side carved into stone walls, buried in papyrus scrolls, and recorded by scribes who witnessed punishments so extreme, so disturbing, that modern scholars debated for decades whether they were even real. Ancient Egypt was one of the most sophisticated civilizations ever to exist on this planet. It produced magnificent art, advanced medicine, and a legal system centuries ahead of its time. But beneath that extraordinary culture lived a society where the power of the pharaoh was absolute, and where breaking the law could lead to consequences that the modern world has since declared too cruel to ever use again. These are not legends. These are not myths passed down by storytellers. What you are about to hear comes from real papyrus records, real tomb inscriptions, and real archaeological findings that survived thousands of years to reach us today. Each image, each carving, each ancient document tells the story of a system of justice that was both brilliant and terrifying. This is the hidden face of the pharaoh's empire. One of the most striking images recovered from Egyptian antiquity is a wall painting found deep inside a tomb near Luxor, dating back to approximately 1300 BCE. It shows a row of men kneeling before an official, their backs exposed, while guards stand behind them, holding long leather whips. This was not a rare scene in ancient Egypt. Flogging was one of the most common punishments used by the state. Records from the reign of Ramesses II describe workers at the royal quarries receiving up to 100 lashes for failing to meet their stone quota. What makes this particular painting so haunting is the expression on the faces of the witnesses, ordinary men watching in silence, knowing they could be next. Among the most important documents ever recovered from ancient Egypt is the Papyrus of Salt, now held in the British Museum. This remarkable scroll, dating to around 1150 BCE, contains the recorded confessions of workers accused of robbing royal tombs, one of the most serious crimes a person could commit in Egyptian society. The punishments described inside that scroll go far beyond imprisonment. Officials recorded sentences involving mutilation, forced labor in the desert mines, and in the most extreme cases, death by burning. The scroll reveals a legal bureaucracy that was meticulous, organized, and absolutely ruthless when the sacred territory of the pharaoh was violated. A carved relief discovered at the temple complex of Medinet Habu shows something deeply unsettling to modern eyes: a pile of severed human noses, carefully counted and recorded by Egyptian scribes. This was not the result of battle rage. It was official policy. Under certain pharaohs, soldiers and criminals who committed acts of betrayal or desertion were punished by having their noses surgically removed, a practice documented in at least 3 separate periods of Egyptian history. The goal was not simply pain. It was permanent social marking. A man without a nose could never hide what he had done. He would carry his punishment on his face for the rest of his life, invisible to every person he ever met. Deep in the Sinai Peninsula, in a place the Egyptians called the Land of Turquoise, archaeologists discovered the remains of a mining operation that dates back nearly 4,000 years. Alongside the turquoise deposits, they found the bones of workers and chains. Being sent to the mines was considered one of the harshest sentences a court could deliver. Conditions were brutal. The desert heat was merciless. Workers were fed just enough to keep them alive and were guarded constantly. Papyrus records from the Middle Kingdom describe men sentenced to the mines for crimes as varied as theft, tax evasion, and speaking against royal authority. Many never came back. Among the most unusual punishments recorded in Egyptian history is one that appears in administrative documents from the New Kingdom period, a sentence known informally by historians as being turned into a living statue. This did not involve actual stone. It involved something arguably worse. Certain offenders, particularly those who had held positions of power, were condemned to a total erasure of identity. Their names were chiseled from every monument, every inscription, every document that bore them. Their images were defaced. Their titles were stripped. They were legally made to not exist. This practice, which Egyptologists called damnatio memoriae, was applied to Pharaoh Akhenaten after his death, to the female pharaoh Hatshepsut, and to officials who fell out of royal favor. To ancient Egyptians, whose entire concept of the afterlife depended on being remembered, this was a punishment considered worse than death. A hieroglyphic text recovered from the New Kingdom period and analyzed by German Egyptologist Siegfried Schott in the early 20th century describes a punishment that shocked modern researchers. For crimes of extreme treason, particularly conspiracies to assassinate a pharaoh, the sentence involved impalement, a method of execution so severe that records suggest it was reserved only for the most catastrophic betrayals. The Judicial Papyrus of Turin, one of the most important legal documents from ancient Egypt, describes the trial of conspirators who attempted to murder Ramesses III. The punishments listed in that document include execution methods that the scribes themselves recorded with unusual detail, suggesting even they found the proceedings extraordinary. Not all punishments in ancient Egypt involved physical pain. Some targeted the spirit. A painting recovered from a noble's tomb in Saqqara shows a group of women in torn garments, their faces covered in ash, performing mourning rituals in public. Beside this scene, hieroglyphic text explains that these women had been sentenced to mourn, not for a loved one, but as a form of public humiliation for crimes involving dishonor to a household. This was a punishment specifically applied to women of certain social standing who had committed acts considered shameful. It stripped them of dignity, forced them into public display, and marked them in their community in a way that could follow them for years. The image is small, almost easy to miss in the crowded tomb decoration. But to those who understand its meaning, it speaks volumes about how Egyptian society controlled behavior through shame as much as through pain. Among the administrative records from the late New Kingdom, scholars have identified references to a punishment applied specifically to those found guilty of perjury, of lying under oath before a court of law. The sentence was the removal of the tongue. To modern readers, this seems extreme. But in Egyptian society, the spoken word carried enormous ritual and legal power. A false oath was considered not merely a legal crime, but a spiritual one, a direct offense against Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. Attacking the tongue that had spoken the lie was, in the logic of that world, a deeply symbolic act of correction. Several papyrus fragments describe this punishment, though historians debate how frequently it was actually carried out versus being recorded as a threat. Scattered across the Nile Delta region, archaeological surveys have identified ancient salt extraction sites where evidence of forced labor has been found. Salt was one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world, used for food preservation, religious rituals, and the mummification process itself. Being assigned to work the salt fields was a sentence that appeared in Egyptian legal records for crimes including robbery and assault. The labor was grueling and the environment corrosive. Workers exposed to salt day after day suffered from skin conditions, eye problems, and respiratory damage. Unlike the mines of Sinai, the salt fields were close to populated areas, meaning workers suffered their punishment in view of the society they had offended, with no escape into distant desert anonymity. A striking detail appears in several Egyptian papier describing punishments for repeat offenders, particularly thieves who had been caught more than once. For a first offense, records describe flogging and restitution. For a second offense, the punishment escalated dramatically. The ears were removed. This practice had both practical and symbolic purpose. Practically, it marked the individual permanently. making it impossible for them to blend back into society without their history being visible. Symbolically, the ears, the instruments through which warnings and laws had been heard and ignored, were taken as a consequence of repeated refusal to listen. At least 2 papyrus documents describe this sentence being handed down by local courts rather than royal decree, suggesting it was not only a state policy, but a community-level response to persistent crime. Among the most disturbing punishments documented in Egyptian history is one that appears in records associated with religious crimes, specifically violations of sacred temple spaces or theft of temple property. Ancient texts describe condemned individuals being bound and thrown into the Nile, into waters where crocodiles were known to gather. The crocodile held deep religious significance in ancient Egypt. Sobek, the crocodile god, was associated with the power of the pharaoh and the unpredictability of the Nile itself. To be consumed by a crocodile was not merely to be killed, it was to be destroyed completely, leaving no body, no chance of mummification, no hope of passing into the afterlife. For a civilization where the preservation of the body after death was the foundation of all spiritual belief, this was perhaps the most total punishment imaginable. Wall paintings discovered at Amarna, the short-lived city built by Pharaoh Akhenaten, include images that scholars have interpreted as depicting the branding of prisoners and convicted criminals. Hot metal applied to skin, leaving permanent marks of ownership, punishment, or identification, appears in enough Egyptian sources to be considered an established practice rather than an isolated incident. Foreign prisoners of war were sometimes branded as part of their reduction to slave status. But certain Egyptian legal records suggest branding was also applied to citizens convicted of serious theft or violence. The mark served as a permanent public record written directly onto the body, a document that could never be lost, destroyed, or denied. To modern sensibilities, having one's head shaved seems like a minor inconvenience. In ancient Egypt, it was something entirely different. Hair, both on the head and the face, carried enormous social and religious significance. Priests shaved their bodies entirely as a mark of purity. Ordinary men and women kept careful control over their hair as an expression of status and identity. A surviving administrative document from the reign of Seti I describes a punishment applied to a group of workers convicted of stealing grain: the complete shaving of their heads and beards, followed by a period of public exposure. The humiliation was calculated and deliberate. To strip a man of his hair was to strip him of his dignity, his social standing, and in some interpretations, his connection to his own identity. In a culture that spent extraordinary resources on wigs, cosmetics, and personal appearance, this punishment cut deeply. One of the strangest punishments recorded in ancient sources connected to Egypt and neighboring regions involves a method that sounds almost absurd until you understand what it meant in practice. Certain texts describe condemned individuals being coated in honey and exposed to the elements, to insects, to the sun, to animals attracted by the sweetness. This punishment appears in records connected to Persia and the broader ancient Near East, but has been referenced in connection with Egyptian practices during the late period, when Persian influence was strong, and the death it produced was slow, agonizing, and prolonged. It was reserved for individuals whose crimes were considered so severe that a quick death was deemed insufficient. The image of a person reduced to this, stripped of all dignity, helpless before nature itself, was as much a message to witnesses as it was a punishment for the condemned. Among the lesser-known punishments in Egyptian legal records is a sentence that appears multiple times in New Kingdom administrative documents, one that modern historians sometimes call perpetual labor service. Individuals convicted of certain crimes against the state were not executed or mutilated. Instead, they were assigned permanently to royal construction projects. This sounds almost merciful until the details emerge. These individuals were stripped of all legal status. They could not own property. They could not marry freely. They could not leave their assigned work. Their children, in some cases, inherited their status. A relief carving from the reign of Thutmose III shows rows of workers hauling enormous stone blocks across the desert, overseen by officials with staffs. Among those workers, records suggest, were men serving sentences that would last the rest of their lives, building monuments to a pharaoh who had condemned them. Legal papyri from the Middle Kingdom period describe a punishment that targeted officials and scribes, the educated class whose words carried weight in Egyptian bureaucracy. Those found guilty of abusing their administrative power, of accepting bribes, or of falsifying records faced a sentence that went beyond physical pain. They were forbidden to speak in any official capacity ever again. Their testimony was made permanently inadmissible. Their documents were declared void. Their seals were broken. In a society where literacy and official voice represented the highest form of social power, being silenced by royal decree was a form of professional and social death. The person continued to breathe and walk and eat, but in every way that mattered to Egyptian society, they had ceased to exist as a citizen. Among the most frequently documented physical punishments in Egyptian legal records is one that appears in both criminal and military contexts: the removal of the hands of those convicted of theft, fraud, or the falsification of official documents. The Wilbur, papyrus, and other administrative texts make reference to this sentence in ways that suggest it was neither rare nor confined to extreme cases. A scribe who altered tax records, a merchant who falsified grain weights, a soldier who stole from a fallen enemy rather than presenting the spoils to the state. All of these offenses appear in documents alongside references to mutilation. The hand that had committed the crime was removed, and the individual was left to live in a society where manual labor was the primary means of survival, now permanently unable to perform it fully. Fire appears as a punishment in several Egyptian texts, most notably in connection with crimes against the gods. Certain religious offenses, desecration of sacred spaces, destruction of divine images, theft of items consecrated to a deity, carried sentences that went beyond the merely physical. The judicial papyrus of Turin references burning in connection with the conspiracy against Rameses III. Other texts describe fire as a punishment connected to specific religious violations, but the significance runs deeper than the method itself. To be burned was to be denied a body, and without a body, there could be no mummification, no journey through the underworld, no eternal life. Fire was not just an execution. It was the permanent cancellation of everything the Egyptian believed awaited them after death. A punishment recorded in texts from the Ptolemaic period, when Greek rulers controlled Egypt but Egyptian traditions remained deeply embedded in the legal system, describes a sentence applied to those convicted of desecrating burial sites. The condemned individual was forced to wear garments made from crocodile skin, treated so that the rough, abrasive surface faced inward against the skin. The garment was then wetted regularly, causing the skin to shrink and tighten over hours and days. This punishment, which appears to modern readers almost unbelievable, was recorded by Greek administrators who seemed equally disturbed by it, preserving the documentation precisely because of its extreme nature, whether applied frequently or rarely. Its mere existence in the legal record tells us something profound about how seriously Egyptian society treated the protection of the dead. Agricultural records from the Middle Kingdom period, analyzed by archaeologist Barry Kemp in his study of the ancient city of Amarna, contain references to ration reduction as a formal legal sentence. Workers convicted of theft, insubordination, or sabotage of royal property were placed on reduced rations, sometimes a fraction of the standard allocation, for defined periods. In a desert civilization where food was the fundamental currency of survival, this was not a mild punishment. A man receiving half rations while continuing to perform full labor was being systematically weakened. The records are cold and bureaucratic in their language, numbers, dates, names. But behind each entry was a human being slowly paying for their crime with their own body. The ancient Egyptians believed that a person's identity existed in multiple spiritual layers: the Ba, the Ka, the Ren. The Ren was the name itself, and it was considered as real and as vital as flesh and bone. To destroy a person's name was to attack their eternal soul. Certain criminals, particularly those who had committed crimes so severe that normal punishments were deemed insufficient, faced a sentence that targeted not their living body, but their eternal existence. Their names were removed from every record accessible to the state. Families were pressured into removing the name from private contexts as well. Monuments were altered. Tombs were defaced. In some documented cases, the name was replaced with the word enemy, so that even the tombstone spoke a condemnation rather than a memory. This was the punishment the Egyptians themselves may have feared most of all. Among the most haunting objects recovered from ancient Egyptian legal contexts is a small wooden board found near Thebes and dated to approximately 1100 BCE that bears a simple carved image: a man kneeling before a court official, arms bound behind him facing a set of scales. Beside the scales sits a feather. This is the symbol of Ma'at, the feather of truth against which every heart was weighed. The image tells us something that no list of punishments can fully convey. The Egyptians did not see their legal system as arbitrary cruelty. They saw it as the maintenance of cosmic balance. Every punishment, no matter how extreme, was understood in their world as a restoration of the order that the crime had broken. Whether we agree with their methods or not, the people depicted in these carvings, the judges, the condemned, the witnesses, all believed they were participating in something larger than themselves. They were trying to keep the world in balance, and they were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to do it. These 22 punishments reveal a civilization of profound contradictions. The same culture that produced the Book of the Dead, one of history's most beautiful meditations on justice and the soul, also produced legal sentences that the modern world has unanimously agreed to forbid. The same scribes who recorded poetry and medical knowledge also carefully documented sentences of mutilation and erasure. What these rare images and ancient documents truly show us is not a civilization of monsters, but a civilization of human beings, brilliant, flawed, powerful, and afraid. Afraid of chaos, afraid of death. Afraid that without absolute law, the desert would reclaim everything they had built. The carvings survive, the papyri survive, and through them, the voices of people who lived 4,000 years ago still reach us, speaking not in words we can hear, but in images we cannot forget. If these forgotten corners of history fascinate you, the stories that never made it into the textbooks, the images that survived thousands of years to reach us, make sure you subscribe. There are thousands of years of hidden history still waiting to be uncovered, and we are just getting started.